Welcome to Optics, where we watch socially impactful documentary shorts and speak with the filmmakers, artists, and activists who made them. I'm your host, Barry Thornburg. The film we are watching today is an episode from the Adopted Life series, NEIKO'S Family, by Angela and Brian Tucker. To start things off, we are joined today by our special guest, Emily Thornton, the on-screen participant in today's film. Emily is a Korean adoptee raised by white parents in a small rural Nebraska town and is now the co-founder and president of Thornton Family Initiative and co-director of 2 family-owned child care centers in Pennsylvania that serve at-risk youth and foster children. Emily will join the board of Foster Love Project in September and speaks to various groups in the adoption triad about openness and prioritizing the needs of the adoptee. In her spare time, she enjoys photography and spending time with the Thornton Family Initiative, co-founder and husband Bruce Thornton, and their 5 children in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Together, they are active in their church where they lead Petra International Ministries youth program. Emily holds a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Emily, thanks for joining us today. Let's define a few things here so that our audience has some understanding when we then talk about your involvement as a non-filmmaker but an on-screen participant in the making of this film. So describe the adoption triad and why is that so important for us to understand or to be able to speak to when in discussions around adoption and foster care and so on.
Yeah, so the adoption triad really consists of the adoptive parents, the adoptee, and then the birth family or first family, however you like to call it. Predominantly in this conversation, historically what has happened in adoption is that the adoptive family's voice really takes precedent, and normally it's adoptive parents. So the work that I do is really to to show and really speak to the lived experience of adoptees who have for so long been put behind what the experiences of adoptive parents are. And certainly the same has happened with birth families widely, is that our voices are characterized as lower importance on the triad scale. So although it's triangular and we're all equally distant, it doesn't really work that way. There's kind of a top and then a bottom. And so what it has felt like in a long-standing history is adoptees and birth families are kind of at the bottom, and then adoptive families or parents are at the top.
Yeah. And I mean, what are some visible effects of that imbalance in the adoption triad?
I think that there's a theme of adoption that is very savioristic and very positive. Everything is a happy ending. You were born in our hearts, not out of our belly. You know, there are things like that have been the norm. And the thought process for people, oh yeah, I really want to adopt. But if you really knew what my experience was or what a lot of other adult adoptees' experiences were, you would know that going into adoption, it's really hard and complex. And there are so many nuances to building a family and being a resource to a child that way.
I mean, we didn't discuss this prior to today, but something that, I mean, just anecdotally, my own experience when learning about adoption or hearing specifically stories that focus on adoption in a more popular culture context, like any talk show that I've seen where adoption is discussed, we're talking to the adoptive parents.
Right. Exactly.
Or in recent memory, I remember seeing an interview with a child that was adopted, but parents were nearby and interjected with details whenever.
Right.
And I just think like, I'm not thinking during that interview that there's some like conspiracy to mask over some terrible thing going on, but it does moderate, and it does introduce a clear dynamic in which the adoptee doesn't have a real opportunity to voice things outside of things that might sound supportive to the adoptive parents, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And agencies alike have endorsed that message because they've built a lot of what they do on the narrative of the adoptive parent, because that's how they recruit more adoptive parents, and they continue in this arena.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's talk a little bit about one of the primary topics that this film is trying to approach is the subtopic underneath adoption and foster care is this concept known as shared parenting. Can you talk about what shared parenting is? And I mean, well, I guess I'll go all the way into, we can just like dissect the issue. But I'm personally involved in the adoption and foster care world. My wife and I are foster parents and adoptive parents. And I get to be involved in trainings here and there and interact with caseworkers all over the place. And we've become not huge, but a resource to other adoptive and foster families or those interested, right? We inadvertently become spokespeople for this system, right? And I've found that the concept of shared parenting, which we'll define and discuss in a sec, actually comes across for a significant number of people as kind of as radical. I mean, I've had someone particularly describe it to me as like, wow, that's kind of radical. That's a little bit too extreme of a situation that I would ever be comfortable with. Like, why? Can you describe shared parenting, but then talk to this? Why would someone look at that as radical?
Yeah, I think that. So for us, it's shared parenting just means that we have Neiko's, my son, so what we'll see in the documentary, but it means that as a foster parent or an adoptive parent, that you allow the first family, the first parents, to have a say in how your child is being raised in their day-to-day lives. It doesn't mean that you give all of the control that happens in your house over to another person. But what it means is that you give dignity and respect to the individual who birthed your child, and you recognize that without them, there is no child. And there's a fairness and an equity there that can be uniquely designed for each family. So there's not a specific roadmap for everybody. It's one of those things that you work through and progress through in time. And I think that it's radical to a lot of people because nobody wants to share. People have a difficult time sharing, and there's a certain level of fragility that comes with being a foster parent or adoptive parent, because a lot of times you're brought into this mentality that children are that you take ownership of children instead of stewarding them to do what is just best for them. So the ownership that you have is that if they are a success or a failure, that totally rides on you. And so you're not going to let anybody, because most of the time what it's demonstrated as and why people think it's radical is because they think that sharing responsibility and sharing parenting roles is going to damage their child. And a lot of that really, if you dive down into it, and we didn't really cover this when we spoke the first time, but when you really dive into it, it's an insecurity, and it's really kind of a diminishing of what the value and worth is of those biological parents. So there's a lot of negative connotations in foster care and adoption of what the first family is. And if they aren't allowed to parent, then there must be a reason. So they probably have nothing to contribute. That's what a lot of people, a lot of what the themes are when you're talking about openness, and you call it shared parenting, we call it openness, because the openness really is framed in every facet of our lives, not just our parenting. It's also in how we have a relationship with his mom too. So it's not always in parenting, but it's required. If you're really going to get into it, it's required in all aspects.
Yeah. I mean, how can you have a relationship with someone vicariously through your child without actually building some sense of rapport with them, right? And
without trying, at least, there are not always guarantees that it works, but no one is talking that there are guarantees, but people still have a difficult time accepting, hey, I should try to bridge this gap more. I should work harder. I should sacrifice this. And it all also comes down to how secure a parent is sharing a title, because what I have found as an adoptee is that it is very often threatening for mothers to have to share things like Mother's Day, or for fathers to have to share Father's Day. And for me, as an adoptee, it just doesn't make any sense, because I know that I have two mothers. And so, it's also a security issue. Yeah.
Well, and I think just connecting dots out of some of the things that you've said already, that, this savior narrative that we get fed and is advertised and is used for recruitment, whether overtly or subtly, can contribute to this lack of openness as well, because well, if I'm saving this child, I'm not going to let that child go back to whatever it is I'm saving them from.
There's like a reversal. There's like a reversal that would just reverse everything that I've done, everything that I've given up.
So there's quite a paradigm shift that is difficult, I see, for people to overcome, not just because one individual here or one individual there holds on to this savior-like mentality that's unhealthy and so on, but because, and you allude to it in the film during your interview, that the system is purposefully and inadvertently set up to cater to this, like, we're going to protect the foster and adoptive parents from any interaction and guard them from this, because that's what they're comfortable with, and we're not going to allow them to interact. And so in your specific case, you found, and this has been similar on our side of things, that we've had to push through those barriers or go around them, or we have to demand for changes to be made so that we can have even access at certain key moments to birth family.
Absolutely. It's I'll give you a stat. So our adoption caseworker, so when it moved from they decided that reunification was not going to be an option. They moved into the adoption phase, and they assigned us a new caseworker out of all the dozens of caseworkers. We got another caseworker. And she said that in her over 20 years of being an adoption caseworker for the county, we were her first family that was openly electing to have an open adoption. So 20 years, you have to imagine how many kids have come across her plate and across her load. And the fact that, I mean, that's just, you think of that and it's so disheartening. It's really sad, because it shows you the structures.
Thousands of people, just that one caseworker alone has interacted with.
And it just shows you the structure, structure in which what the norm exists, and how it's, how it's changing, how we're trying to get it to change, how we want it to change, really for the benefit of the child.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about things that you are doing personally to try and make that change. Let's talk about the filmmaking side of things. As a participant in the film, like I mentioned before, this is a unique opportunity for us to actually speak to someone who has the camera pointed at them, and I found it. As a filmmaker, extremely important for me to understand what that feels like and to understand some of the pressures that are involved, some of the concerns that are involved here. And I think your story about how the making of this film took place and your involvement of it is a pretty great example of what filmmakers should be striving for in telling a story, because the story is quite compelling. It has all of the traditional elements that filmmakers would want. It has a really compelling story, wonderful characters, emotional moments and high points and low points, and all those wonderful, like film school things. But at the same time, the filmmakers, Angela and Brian, took a rather non-traditional route in filmmaking. And so can you describe going into this, like what's your relationship with Angela and Brian, and how did that play dynamic in the making of this film?
Yes, it was. I mean, this film would never have existed if our relationship wasn't what it was prior to filming. So we spent Angela and I really had tossed this idea around for about a year, and Angela and I are just really good friends. I would consider her one of my best friends. And then my husband is very close with her husband, Brian. So we're all four very interconnected. And they've been on this journey with us from the very first moment that we were when we became foster parents to Neiko, our son. And so and I've said this definitely publicly, but there are only two people in the world I ever would have entrusted this story to, because it's so deeply personal, and it cannot be exploitative. I mean, like, it can't. We have to be really careful with what we share and what we don't have to share. And so I think that because we had that relationship, when they came to film, they spent the whole weekend with us. We hosted them in our house. Like, we hung out, and we took them just like we would take any other guests around Pittsburgh, around our favorite things, and doing just our everyday activities. So a lot of the reason why the film came across that way was because they were just with us for 72 hours straight, waking up with us, eating with us. We were going out to dinner, showing them our favorite places, and just spending quality time with our friends. And so a lot of the conversations that came of that were just really natural, because they've been with us through this all, and they've seen it on their end. They live far away, but we keep really connected. So that's why we were able to really feel open and vulnerable with this story, because we felt like it was always going to be told the right way.
Yeah. I mean, I think to highlight for those watching and those who will watch, especially the filmmakers out there, documentary film, we're always interested in, like, getting access. Do you have access to the story? And like, what's your relationship to the story? How can we know that you're going to, I mean, seeking funding is all around these questions of, like, who are these people that you're going to be covering? Do you have access to them? How much time do you get to spend with them? What do you know about them already? Stuff like that. And so what I hear from you, translating it into something that's helpful for me as a filmmaker, is the trust and the relationship that you have was the thing that even made it possible to start this story or consider telling this story, right? I mean, if let's take let's pretend that I'm the one that says, hey, I heard that you started fostering this little boy. I'm an adoptive parent myself and a foster parent. I know this world. I know this world. Can I
Right.
film you and your husband and your son and possibly gain access to his first mother as well? Can we tell that story? Like, how would you react to someone like me approaching you like in that way?
Well, no offense, but no, it wouldn't. I mean,
Right.
it really wouldn't even be a consideration. Yeah, just and really, it's not because there are not beautifully talented, really great, forward-thinking filmmakers out there. I think that it's just when you hold something so close to your heart, you want to make sure that it's not cut in a way that's really going to leave you crying when it's finalized and released and rendered, because I have known instances where that has happened to some of
Yeah.
the people that I know when they've gone on either to get an interview or to, it doesn't, there's just a variety of ways that things can get chopped up.
Right.
And the beauty of it was a journey that we all took together. And Brian's and Angela's technical skills and being able to express the narrative, it just goes to show how deeply connected they are in this world. They
Absolutely.
asked all the right questions. They asked, and these were some conversations that Angela and I had actually never been able to have. I mean, we've had a ton of conversations, but the things that she asked me, I had never answered before. Because there's just like a daily grind sometimes that you're like, oh my gosh, my friends, they don't need to be burdened with this right now,
Sure. Yeah.
So so they asked all the right questions, and they let us be a part of the process. Everything was transcribed, everything was they were just so transparent about what story and what angle they were telling it from, and it just felt so honest. So it wasn't even a worry. We were just excited finally when it was over.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into it, so there's always a major relief when it's done, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, the emotional energy that goes into it too. I think as someone on camera, as someone being scrutinized in this way, even if it's by friends, is emotionally tolling. There's a lot of emotional labor involved in this, right? And so let's talk then. I often talk with other filmmakers and my students even about the power dynamic involved in filmmaking, that whoever holds the camera has power that is often violent, and we need to appreciate that. And in a story like this, there are lots of parties involved that have varying levels of say over their situation, and it's not as it's more complex, I find, than simply I can shut this interview down because I don't like it anymore or not, right? There's different social pressures that play into whether or not someone feels compelled to continue on with something they don't feel comfortable with or what have you. Let's talk about Brienne, Neiko's first mother, and let's talk about her involvement and how did you what role did you play as one of the primary participants in this? What role did you play in that relationship between the filmmakers and her?
Well, I played, I connected everything in the sense that basically Brianne and I, over the years, like we have developed such a deep trust of one another that we're always honest. And so when I brought this to her and I said, Brian and Angela, they're dear friends of ours, that was basically all she needed to know, because she wanted to participate. She loves our family so much. She adores her son, as you can see in the film too. So all of these things were, okay, does Emily trust them? Because if she does, okay, so it was really that simple. It didn't have to be complicated. She was ready and she was willing to share, because I think that our lives have just ultimately been so transformed So I guess I just was the connecting bridge to bring that piece of it together.
For sure. Yeah. And added on to that, I think, at least in the hierarchy, I'm used to kind of, if you will, ranking things in terms of who has power and who doesn't. Lastly, I think of Neiko and his involvement in the film, and based off of our discussion, can you talk about kind of the decision making as far as his involvement in the film? Because as you'll probably highlight as well, like this is revolving around a situation that is quite sensitive for him, and he even if he wanted to say something about this happening, he may not have the vocabulary to articulate any sort of discomfort he may feel at any time. So like, talk to me about your discussions with Angela about his involvement and the decision making that played into what amounted to the film we have now.
Yeah. So Angela and I, because we're both adoptees and because for most of our lives, our stories were just out there, and they, they've been put out there, whether, growing up, we wanted them to be out there or not. It just was in your face because both of us are transracially adopted. So of course, if you don't look like your parents, wow. How did your family come to be? That's like number one question, no matter if you're in the supermarket or not. So our experience was definitely different. And Neikos is a lot less, there's a lot less attention because, my husband is Black, Neiko is Black. And so when you talk about ethical story sharing, you're really talking about putting up boundaries that allow for a child to be, for an adoptee, particularly for really the lived experience of who he is and what he wants to be and what he's gone through on this journey of being adopted, you leave space for him to tell that. And I feel that the way that we approached his involvement in the film was mostly through imagery, because there was never even a question of if we would sit down and talk to Neiko about anything. Because number one, he's just too young. Yeah. And number two, the point of having this conversation and having this story developed was to help other people understand that there is a different way that adults in a child's life can actively make good decisions that will be able to help that child when he gets ready to want to talk about his adoption. So I view NEIKO'S Family, the reason why we didn't name it NEIKO's Story is because it's not his story. It's a piece of his family. And so we titled it NEIKO'S Family for that reason, because someday, if and when Neiko's ready, he will get to tell his own story.
Yeah. Yeah. And what again, translating this through a filmmaker's perspective, it really rings true to me what you said at the beginning about, you started this all off talking about both your experience and Angela's experience as adoptees, that played a pretty important role in how this film became what it was. And for filmmakers, is film school trains us into this extractive approach to filmmaking. We find a story, we capture it. Even our vocabulary is hinged around this extractive approach of, you go in, you capture the imagery, you capture the audio, you capture that story, and then you cut it up and rearrange it however you feel like, to tell a great story that an audience is going to appreciate. And while there are elective courses that talk about the ethics of that, and occasionally you'll get a paragraph or a chapter devoted to that in a textbook somewhere, largely this is the tradition of filmmaking, and we're going to go get those stories one way or another. And little consideration is made about, am I even the filmmaker that should make this? Or am I the right storyteller here? Right.
Right.
Do
Wow.
I
Yeah.
even have a lived experience that is up to the task of telling this story?
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
And I think as much as we as filmmakers, especially because of how we're trained, we hate to think that like our identity, our personal identity can be a roadblock in
Sure.
itself. It really presents blind spots, and
Yeah.
at best it turns a wonderful intimate story that can be impactful and help people. It turns it into something a little bit more vanilla, or dilutes
Right.
it. At worst, it actually promotes continues and promotes harmful stereotypes,
Sure.
perpetuates mythology that doesn't exist, right? And
Absolutely.
can actually cause people to be involved in a particular topic in an unhealthy way, right? And so there's that side of it, and then understanding that and again, filmmakers hate this idea, especially documentary filmmakers, of boundaries, that actually
Yeah.
deliberately setting up boundaries can actually help us tell the
Yeah.
meaningful stories, right? That
Sure.
restricting ourselves intentionally can actually benefit the story because it refocuses the story into what we really need to focus on, right? That's wonderful.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. I think it's, I mean, far too often, we, filmmaker or non-filmmaker alike, we're so interested in like what was the process in making this film from the filmmaker's perspective that we forget the impact that is had once the film crew leaves. We forget the just even outside of the film and whether or not people saw it or how they reacted, just the impact of the crew being around there, right?
Yeah.
Now, is there any, I mean, what impact do you feel like the film had overall? How do you feel the film was received?
Oh gosh. I mean, I really think that it was received very positively. I think it was really surprising because I mean, my husband and I, we have never really talked all that much about fostering Neiko. I mean, our closest friends, knew a lot about that. But when it came to what we were building with Neiko's mom and with his family, his cousins, his relatives, like we work in the community that he was born in, which we're very grateful to be able to do that. When it came to all of that stuff, there weren't a lot of people on the outer fringes of our life that knew what was happening. So when it was released, I remember being flooded with emails and messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, that were just like on the outskirts. And it was really encouraging because they had never seen. It was kind of like people got a bird's eye view into my life.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I come from such a small town. So on social media, when I start seeing things get passed around to older siblings of people I went to high school with, like
Right.
it's kind of crazy, right? It feels weird. But at the same time, I just felt as though mostly people were able to relate to the humanity of it. And because of that, I think that it was fairly well received. I think even the adoption community received it fairly positively. I heard a lot from other adoptees that were just so grateful to see a story that the intent of it was to really just stake on that need that the adoptee has and what the right is for that adoptee to deserve both families. So, that's not a mainstream story that often gets put out there. So yeah, there were a couple of comments that came back that were harsh, but I mean, for the majority of them, I think people were really excited about seeing a nuanced perspective.
Yeah, can you? You had mentioned one comment that you got that was particularly thought-provoking, at least for me to listen to. Can you talk about that experience of getting some critical feedback and kind of how you felt about that?
Yeah, it was just a tweet, and I just remember it. Basically, the theme of the tweet, I can't even remember exactly what it said, but
No,
the
I
theme
want
of it was,
usernames. I want,
yeah. I'm just like trying to think. I can't even remember, but basically the message of it was, me as an adoptee, if that adoptee is so woke, basically, she wouldn't have adopted in the first place. And I'm in agreement with a lot of people that don't believe adoption is the right answer, the all-time answer. I believe that adoption should be the absolute last option for a child, if they are not to be raised with their kin or with their biological parents. But life is very complicated, and it doesn't mean I have a license to just do whatever. It just means that there are harsh alternatives for children in foster care. And as you know, as a foster parent, sometimes it's them languishing in foster care for years, or it's going to residential facilities, or it's just never being able to call a home and a family. So sometimes when those are the alternatives, then I think, yeah, adoption seems to be that answer. And knowing my son and knowing Neiko and knowing his mom, I never would have made a different choice. My husband and I never would have made a different choice. And I think that it's just really important to know that it's not always a matter of pro-adoption or anti-adoption.
Yeah.
You have to look at the complexities and the structures that are already in place, and the children that are already put in really impossible positions.
Yeah. And like we had discussed, like I find it, the essentialism of that argument is struggles to recognize that, okay, this is a complex system, like you pointed out, and we need to be able to do both. Like, there's dire consequences if we just abandon foster care and adoption altogether right now. Like, there's a lot of people involved that are going to be hurt by just dropping it all. And so it's good to be able to dismantle systems of oppression and take care of those who are currently affected by it at the same time, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that I obviously would have no leg to stand on if I didn't feel as though we had done everything in our power to ensure that the preservation of his family existed, whether the law said it did or didn't.
Yeah.
Because we were not legally bound to do that. We chose to do that because we knew that for the betterment of Brianne's life and for the betterment of Neiko's life, they needed each other.
Yeah. And fortunately for both, they were available to see each other and continue that relationship. And now it's what it is today, thankfully. Well, let's go ahead and switch over to the film, and then afterwards we'll engage in a Q&A, and based on questions that come up either during the film or during the Q&A, I will ask those. But if we have a quiet audience, then I have plenty of questions to continue adding on. All right.
Great.
Excellent. Emily, thank you so much for being with us while we watch this film. And special thanks to Angela and Brian for allowing us to watch this film on our show. It's wonderful to have this opportunity. Any chance I get to amplify narratives that help in the adoption and foster world, the better. Now, as far as questions for post viewing, did you have any hiccups in the making of the film that were unexpected, that you maybe weren't planned but really popped up and we had to figure out how to deal with that?
Yeah, so we had scheduled this like filming a long time ahead. I think it was probably 6 months in advance. And I got pregnant again. So in the film, I just have recently given birth to our second son. And
No big
so
deal.
while we were filming, I was actually pregnant again. And which is why, like, sometimes you can see a baby bump, sometimes you can't. I was like, oh my goodness, I was like, of course I'll be really large through this production. But so that was unplanned and I was a little self-conscious of that. But as far as everything else goes, we had great weather. We were able to do most of the activities that we had already planned that we wanted to do. And then also, I think that the biggest thing was making sure that our schedules coincided with Brianne's.
Yeah.
Because at that time we were seeing her more intermittently because she had a lot going on. So it was really beautiful that it worked out for her to be with us so frequently while we were filming. And it was really fun for Neiko, and the way that she plays with Zephaniah, our other son. I mean, they're just, it's really funny because as they've gotten older, Neiko's always sure to remind Zephaniah whenever Brianne comes over, when we talk to her on the phone, it's Mommy Brianne. Like, he calls her Mommy Brianne too. Like, that's Zephaniah's other mommy too.
Yeah.
So it's like a really natural, beautiful thing. So in the film, it was really nice because I was so exhausted. So it was so wonderful to have her and Angela around helping tote this baby around.
For sure.
Tote this 5-month-old around, because I was just like, I was really at that stage where I was tired.
Well, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes an even greater village to make a film around children.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what's something that is not included in the film that you think is vital for people to understand about this topic?
Oh my goodness. I think that one of the things that we didn't have time to include, and maybe it was just way too much backstory, but we actually had some tough encounters, like tough physical encounters, where there were some things that were damaged, like property or whatever, before we sat down in mediation. And it was really important that in mediation we were able to speak to Brianne about that face to face, because it was just kind of rumored as to like who was the source of that and what was happening, and emotions run high. I think that people fail to really understand just how devastating, just how threatening it can be to have your child move to another foster placement, because we weren't his first foster placement. So something that wasn't talked about in the film was that we all had to overcome certain things that we had been told about one another prior to our relationship, like really being able to take off, and a lot of that is just misinformation. And it's the fact that there's not a good connection that can be made in the beginning to form a relationship. And sometimes, even if that were a possibility, individuals might not be ready for that. So there's a very complicated thing that has to happen. And I know that Brianne and I have talked about it at length. It's just that a lot of it is about truly understanding, truly being able to forgive anything and be able to move past it and not hold it over somebody, especially if they weren't like solely responsible. If maybe it was a family member that was trying to stand up for it, like we're 15 minutes from all of his family. So it's hard to know for certain. But the message of that is that whether you qualify something as dangerous or not, I mean, I have felt threatened in my life in this particular, way that we came to be. And that still is not a good enough reason for me to cut my child off from the possibilities of connection. So yeah, that didn't make it in there because it was just a lot, but
Takes a lot of explanation, a lot of
it does
context,
take a
right?
lot. It does. It's a lot of context, and it's just, that was a long process for us, and to condense it down, we just didn't do that.
Is that something that was discussed in the interview, just it never made it to the film because of that?
Yeah, there's just so much backstory. There's so much, and also I think it's really important, as you're talking about, there's an ability to sensationalize things, right? As filmmakers, you can totally take something and sensationalize it, make that the focal point, rather than what is really important. And so we just didn't want there to be a focus on property damage versus the other stuff.
Let's not let that become a distraction to the point, right?
Because it doesn't matter at this point to us. So
I think about a time, probably one of the most I'm not telling you anything, but for the audience and those who will eventually see this, if you get involved in foster care, like there's training and lots of training, and just lots and lots of training, and depending on the state you're in, continued training, and just more and more and more, and good, fine, like there's no complaint about that, but probably the most influential training of the what now seems like hundreds and hundreds of trainings I've been to, and one that's always stuck out in my mind was one in which there wasn't actually a PowerPoint presentation. No one was actually instructing on best practices or theory or anything like that. We had a foster adoptive mom and a first mother in a room, and they told the story from beginning to end, and they were vicious about it. I mean, they were totally okay with each other, obviously, because they were together doing this, but they were blunt, and they shared their feelings about each other throughout the entire process. And it showed the final product of this story was that the family had an openness that you had talked about, and that there was this beautiful relationship and a redefinition of what family, what kinship is, that has benefited everyone in the family, but particularly the kids involved, and that the kids now have the best possible outcome because of this. But being able to understand the nitty gritty and the difficulties, both on a personal, interpersonal, and just systemic level that each person had to go through to get to that point, was eye-opening. That, this isn't a happily ever after thing. This is a process that continues and grows and evolves, because we're people, and that's how it works. And for filmmaking, that's a particularly difficult thing to capture. And often why we resort to sensationalism, because it's shorthand for so much.
Yeah, definitely.
It's really hard. It's really hard. So I think what I do find helpful about this film is, for me anyways, is that it does hint at some things, and we do talk a little bit about some of the harder truths about the situation, which helps us appreciate all the more the final outcome for everyone involved. But I agree. I think there is a nuance there, and there's a lot of what if questions that go unanswered for a lot of people who would be viewing the film.
Right. Yeah. And so whenever my husband and I, whenever we speak about it, and Brianne too, so it's really unfortunate, because we were set to present this summer to the Swan Permanency Conference, which is like the whole state of Pennsylvania, and a lot of professionals, but also a lot of foster families. They attend that every year. And we were set to present, actually, all of us together for the first time since the documentary had been released. We were going to be presenting and actually doing it in tandem with the attorney who was our mediator and who, worked that portion of things. And so we were all going to sit down and have a conversation. And so when it comes to that, you know, there are a lot of, I would say, you know, there are just some things where people are always like, but our case is so unique. Our case is just so much harder. And what you guys had to do was way easier, you know? And so that's why we were ready to have that full on conversation, because Brianne and Bruce and I, we would be able to really tell you that in the beginning, it was kind of like give up status, you know, and a lot of the driving force and why we got to where we were was just based on the premise of, am I going to do what I always said that I was going to do as an adoptee? And my husband coming back to me after some time had passed, you know, and we needed to take like a break, some space from the situation. And I was finished, you know, in my head. And he just came back with my words and was like, okay, honey, I think now is the time, you know, it's been a couple months now, we have to reevaluate. And I've talked to Brianne about this. And, you know, the really beautiful thing about how the film was made was also that Brianne's interview was totally solely her and Angela. So none of us were present. It was only Brian and Angela with Brianne. And then it was only Brian and Angela with my husband. And then it was only Brian and Angela with me. So absolutely, when the final version got cut and I heard Brianne's voice and saying what she said, it was so deeply emotional for me, because I was like thinking to myself, she really feels this way about me, you know, because I wasn't there. She didn't have to work to save my feelings. She didn't have to say anything nice about me if she didn't want to, because that was the whole truth of her narrative. Whatever she wanted to say, that was what she got to say. And so to hear her say in the film, I'm really grateful I don't need her to be grateful to me, but it's so endearing when I hear how much she cherishes our family too. And because it just goes to show that you should never, ever give up when it comes to the hard realities of what foster care is. And so that stuff didn't make it in, sure. but yeah.
Excellent. Well, tell me about what you're working on now. You happen to be working on a particular project that we alluded to before the film that is attempting to address. I won't say solve, because that's a big thing, but you're attempting to address some very glaring issues, at least in the foster care system in your area. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my husband and I this year, we have founded the Thornton Family Initiative, and we're getting ready to launch it. But really, our pillars are that we are trying to find and develop foster families of color so that we can get at the transracial foster care placement percentage, which is almost half in Allegheny County. So that means that half of the Black children in foster care in Allegheny County are being placed in transracial homes, so mostly white homes. And we just think that number is staggering. And the experience of those kids is an even harder fought battle on a daily basis, especially when you see what's going on in this world, you know. So we are working to secure resources and funding, and also just an overarching build in basically our own support for more young foster families of color. And on top of that, educating existing foster families on openness in foster care and adoption. So those are the things that agencies have difficult times making huge shifts in these things, because they're always carrying around a lot of other baggage, like quotas and the placement restrictions and all. I mean, there's just a plethora of things that they cannot do. So our initiative aims to really get at providing more families of color for more kids of color, and doing so with an openness at the heart of what they're fostering for.
Excellent. Excellent. If people want to follow you, follow in your progress of this, or just get in contact with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, absolutely. So my Instagram, I am MJ Thornton, EMJ Thornton, my last name. And right now my email is just emily.thornton@outlook.com. We will be launching soon tfinitiative.com, but we haven't gotten it together yet. But that is by the end of 2020 for sure, over the next couple months.
That's exciting. That's exciting. Well, Emily Thornton, thank you so much for not just participating in this, but sharing more of your experience outside of what's already contained in the film. I think this perspective is particularly valuable, especially as we attempt to existing filmmakers like myself, but also filmmakers that are in the making, are attempting to redefine what filmmaking is, what it looks like, and how we move forward in a world of nonfiction storytelling like this. And I think this puts us on a good step forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me.